Good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to be here. It's great to once again be able to assemble together to sing songs of praises to God, to give Him glory and honor, and to lift Him up. When we're here together, that should always be our first and foremost purpose for being here. To give God glory and honor. To rejoice at the joy that we have and hope in Him. To rejoice at the sacrifice that He made for us. It's really an exciting time to come together. Apart from that, we have other reasons for coming together. We're here together to learn more about the Bible. We're here together to encourage one another as we see the day drawing near, to encourage one another to keep living the Christian life, to shine bright in a dark world. We're to encourage one another to go out and seek and save the lost. We're to encourage one another to encourage one another, to be there to support one another. This Sunday night series we've been going through is one that's not just purely been a history lesson. We've been going through the kingdom after David. It's kind of a study of 1 Kings and the different things that went on after David's kingship, leading into Solomon, and you might call it the decline of the kingdom. But throughout this series, what things that we've been wanting to notice is how God's relationship with Israel existed in a time when there was decline. At a time when slowly you see kings drifting further and further away from God. At a time when you see a kingdom, His people, get further and further away from where He wants them to be. Throughout this study, we've noticed several different things. We've noticed how sometimes when you can back the wrong horse. Sometimes you can put all your faith or trust in one person or one individual, and it doesn't work out how it should. How we should look to God for that guidance. We've looked at various aspects of this letter and how it's going to continue on in the future, but I don't want us to get distracted for our main purpose for this lesson. The Old Testament isn't just there to be a history lesson. It's there for our learning, but sometimes I think we mistake that as being a history lesson. Something that's there in case we ever want to brush up on what happened. But that is not exactly what's meant there. See, it's there for our learning because people have had a relationship with God before Jesus came to this earth and died on the cross. People had a relationship with God. His people had a relationship with Him. And during that time, they had to strive to be more like God. They had to strive to become more holy. They had to strive to live in a world where God was not respected and acknowledged by many men. They had to live amidst kingdoms sometimes where God was not the center, where God was not acknowledged, where God was not honored or praised. Throughout this study, I want us to see how God's people have had a relationship with Him. The title of this evening's lesson is David's Last Wishes. David's Last Wishes. If you want to, go ahead and be turning over in your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. That's going to be our text for this evening's lesson. To kind of set the scene for what all has happened so far, you have David nearing the end of his life. He knows he's not going to have very long. His family knows he's not going to have very long. And someone named Adonijah, a child of his, has been slowly gaining popularity with the people. And David, up till this point, has not reproved him, has not rebuked him, or said that what he was doing was wrong, perhaps like he should have. And Adonijah gained a certain fame with the people to where he believed he had a move for the throne, even though it had been stated before that Solomon would reign after David. Many individuals backed Adonijah in his pursuit of the throne, in his pursuit to usurp the throne from Solomon, but it didn't work out too well. Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba got wind of this, and they came together and found a way to show David what was going on and how to solve the problem. Now Solomon's kingdom is established. He's going to be king after David, and now he's going to be reigning. And in chapter 2 beginning, we have some instructions that David is going to give his son Solomon, the next king over Israel, and how he should conduct himself, and what he would like for him to do, and what should be some goals for his kingdom. If you will, begin reading with me there in 1 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. When David's time drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways. Walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses. That you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. That the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack an heir on the throne of Israel. Moreover, you also know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in a time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting the blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals of his feet. Act therefore according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. But deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such loyalty they met me when I fled from Absalom, your brother. And there is also with you Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjamite, from Bahuriam, who cursed me with a grievous curse on the day I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man. You will know what you ought to do to him, and you shall bring his gray down with blood to Sheol. Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Thank you for following along in that with me. I know it may be a little difficult, things not being synced up. If you don't get anything else out of this evening's lesson, please notice these three things that David tried to communicate to Solomon. First, David told Solomon he was going the way of all man. That he was going to be doing the same thing that all mankind would be doing. Second thing he wanted Solomon to notice was that he needed to show himself a man. He said, show yourself a man. We're going to look in more detail about exactly what that means. And third and finally, he told Solomon to finish his work. To finish some of the works that needed to be accomplished. Some of the things that either David could not do during his lifetime or wished for Solomon to do after he was gone. But first, what does it exactly mean when David tells Solomon he's going to be going the way of all the world, going the way of all mankind? This is not a new concept. It's not something that we've never seen or heard of before. It certainly is not something that we do not understand, the concept of mankind dying. You see, everybody dies. It's something that we'll all have to face. No matter where you live, no matter what your station in his life, unless you're here living to the point when Jesus comes again, you're going to have to face death. Some have said that we avoid this concept and attempt to remain sane. That's quite possible. I know I'm terrified of death. I've heard many people say, and I've heard many preachers preach it, don't fear death because you have a God in heaven that can conquer death. Well, I would word that slightly differently. It's not that I fear dying and its power it has over me. I just fear the action itself. I desire to be with the Lord. I desire to be in His courts, to singing His praises. I desire to see that world He has prepared for us. I desire to be in His presence, to be away from all this heartache. But the idea of death itself scares me. It frightens me. I'd be kidding myself to say it wasn't. It terrifies me. It doesn't necessarily show lack of faith as much as an acknowledgement of how finite it is. How much of a barrier it is that we all have to cross. But nonetheless, it is something that we will all have to face. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27 conveys this idea quite precisely, I believe. You see, it's going to be up to every man to die. It's appointed for all men to die, and then comes the judgment. It's not something that we can get around. It's not something that we can avoid. It's not something we can run away from. And when David is telling his son Solomon, I'm going the way of all mankind, He's not just communicating something that's happening to him, he's also communicating to Solomon something that will be happening to him. Something that will be happening to Solomon. There is no man that can avoid death. Although many have tried, haven't they? Many have tried to find ways to avoid death, to live eternally, to live forever outside of God. Solomon himself tried to find happiness inside the world and life he had here, seeing that there was no way to escape death. He sought to find some happiness, some sense of worth under the sun, some way to enjoy things here without God. But there is no way to escape death here on earth. There is no way to not have to face that ultimate end that we all have. The only hope we can have is in the hereafter. And I think therein lies David's actual message. David knew his end was coming. David knew that he was going to have to face God. He knew that he was going to have to face death. But I think there is deeper in there a message that should strike to all of us. It's not to avoid death, but to prepare for it. Not to seek to escape death, but be ready for it when it comes. David certainly knew when he died that he needed to be ready. David certainly knew the importance of being ready to face death because it surely was coming. But apart from the Hebrew writer saying that everyone's going to die and then comes the judgment, this isn't the only place where that's found. We don't just have to look to the Hebrew writer making the point that dying is what precedes the judgment and that you can't avoid judgment. But wisdom literature has always taught us that death is something that's certain. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19, going all the way back to the beginning, God told Adam, you will have to face death. You were made of dust, and to that very same dust you will return. Now this is where things get a little interesting. In the Garden of Eden, there were two trees. There were many others, but two trees of significance to note right now. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were commanded not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but it seems they ate freely of the tree of life. It was only after partaking of the forbidden fruit, if we could call it that they were forbidden to be a part of the tree of life, to take part in the tree of life. That's when God cast them out of the garden and set the angel and the flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Because once you have tainted not only this world, once you've tainted yourself, you can't be in God's presence eternally. The Garden of Eden was no longer a suitable place for man to dwell eternally. Sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that if Adam and Eve had never ate of that fruit, that everything would be hunky-dory and everything would be okay. Wouldn't there eventually be someone to make a mistake? Would somebody eventually have succumbed to the tempter's temptation? Would someone eventually have listened to that serpent? I believe so. Paul seems to think that about ourselves as well. Perhaps he's looking more to the fact that after the garden and after that mistake there was more rampant wickedness. And so it would seem nearly impossible for someone to go through an entire lifetime without sinning. He sees that everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that none's righteous, no, not one. The preacher in Ecclesiastes makes the point that you can't find a person who hasn't sinned. And certainly the more rampant that wickedness becomes all around us, when it seems to be knee-deep everywhere we look and everywhere we turn, there's no way of escape. It will eventually face every person. But in the beginning it was not intended to be so. As a result of sin, everybody dies. But Solomon's only point to David was not that he would have to face death. He didn't just want to leave, or David's point to Solomon was not just that he would have to die. But David was informing him he would have to die, so that there was a responsibility that would now pass on to Solomon. Can you imagine the weight, the burden that Solomon would now be bearing? I believe he understood it. Later in the story of Solomon, something I'm sure we'll cover in another lesson, he requests God to give him something. And what he requests for, I think, shows wisdom in of itself. He doesn't ask for riches, for power, for blind obedience from his people. He asks for the wisdom to be able to lead God's people because he feels inadequate to do so. If only we recognize our own inadequacies, sometimes like Solomon did. And God blessed him with that and more. You see, the second thing that David communicated to Solomon was that he needed to show himself a man. Maybe you have received similar advice from your father. Maybe not in those words. Maybe your parents communicated to you that you needed to show yourself a man, but in different words. You see, showing yourself a man does not mean showing yourself a male. Does not mean showing yourself of the male gender. What is being communicated is something deeper. It's not necessarily blind bravery, as sometimes we take that to mean. It's not simply never fearing anything, as often it is taken. But showing yourself a man is a deeper point that's being made here. David's encouraging Solomon to take up the mantle that has been passed on to mankind. David is encouraging Solomon to be the person that God wants mankind to be. To show not simply God, but to the world around him. Solomon's going to be in a precarious position. He's going to be the ruler of God's people. He's going to be responsible for showing an example to all the world, all the known nations, what God's man should look like. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. At the end of the preacher in Ecclesiastes' explorations, trying to figure out what God desires or how to find happiness on earth, fulfillment on earth under the sun without God, he comes to this final conclusion. That there is a purpose for man. He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. What's the purpose of mankind? What is our purpose here on this earth? Some say it's to pursue knowledge. It's to better ourselves. In fact, grafted into our very own American history, it's what? It's the pursuit of happiness. I don't mean to rain on your parade, but man's purpose is not to pursue his own happiness. Man's purpose is not to pursue liberty. Man's purpose is not his own life. Solomon himself concluded the whole duty of man was to fear God and to keep His commandments. Man was made to kneel before his Creator, before his God. Instead, man often finds himself bowing to other things. You see, a man that's made to kneel will inevitably do so. It just so happens that many times we bow before other men. Many times we bow before worldly possessions. Many times we bow before ourselves and our pride. Whatever it may be, we find ourselves often bowing except before the one Creator we were meant to bow to. We find ourselves serving everything but the Lord in heaven, which we were made to serve, who we were created to serve. What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning to life? A question that everyone seems to seek. Fear God and keep His commandments. To serve the God in heaven, our Lord, our Savior. Showing yourself a man, as I mentioned before, isn't about taking on the attributes we often see the male gender being prized at. It's about digging deeper. But it certainly does have something to do with courage. If you'll notice, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 13, Paul encourages the church at Corinth to do just that. He says, be watchful. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. That language there could be something describing girding yourself up, preparing for battle. It could be something describing acting as you are called to act in a courageous way. Preparing for what was coming. David wanted Solomon to understand the weight of the burden that would be coming on his shoulders. David wanted Solomon to understand that eyes would be looking to him. That people would be counting on him to make decisions. If anyone knew the consequences, the bad consequences of bad decisions, it was David. Do you remember that census he took towards the end of his life? Do you remember the consequences of his bad decision? How many people died at the hands of that angel wreaking havoc in Israel before God stayed that angel's hand? How many suffered because of David's poor judgment? I don't know if that's exactly what David was thinking back to. I don't know if he was thinking about his mistake he made with Bathsheba and the matter of Uriah the Hittite. I don't know exactly what was coming to his mind, but I can only imagine that some of these things might have occurred. He urged his son Solomon. He urged him to be a man, to show himself a man. But this wasn't the only thing he communicated once again. His desire was not just for him to prepare for his death, for him to live his life in such a way that was respectful, that honored his God in heaven, and that was serving him all the days of his life. David desired his son Solomon to finish some of the work he started. Apart from Solomon just being a man, an individual, a human, Solomon, like I had mentioned before, has this great burden on his shoulders. He's going to be king. There are some responsibilities that he's going to have simply because of his station in life, because of who he is and his occupation. The king of Israel was required at the beginning of his term to write down in his own hand the entire law so that he would know it. And he was required to read it all the days of his life. See, there is a huge requirement here for any of those that are in a position where they have to make decisions. For anyone in a position where they have some responsibility and others under their charge, under their care. But specifically here, there have been some things that had happened that David had not yet dealt with. Perhaps it was something that he couldn't deal with. Maybe he just would not be the right man for the job. I think that's correct in some of these circumstances. I think some of these things, it was just not David who needed to deal with it. But regardless, David communicated to Solomon that he needed to take care of these things. That there were some things he needed to attend to. And we read a moment ago what those things were. Have you never noticed how sometimes these things play out? You ever noticed how when evil is done, it tends to come back around? You ever notice when good is done, it tends to come back around? I've heard said before that if you take someone who is generally nice to others, others would be generally nice to them. And I've also heard it said before that if you take someone who is generally not nice, mean, cruel, unjust to others, people find themselves being mean and unjust to them. I think Jesus somewhat surmised this when he said, those who live by the sword die by the sword. That kind of has a way of coming back around to you. If you find yourself living a violent life, violence will often come back to you. But I find it interesting here in this final charge that David gives Solomon. He tells him to wrap up these matters. Some things that some pretty respectful people, respectable people in Israel had done that had consequences that David himself could not delve out. In Jeremiah 22 and verse 3, thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness. Deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been wronged. And do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place. Solomon had a responsibility as the ruler of that people. He had to execute justice. He had to make sure justice was served. There are a lot of people that have a real problem trying to rationalize how it can be wrong to take a life, yet justified if someone else has taken a life, for that blood to then come back on them. Similar to what God told Noah, similar to what we see in the law of Moses, where there was a punishment for murder. They'll say, how does one justify another? Well, that's where this justice idea comes into play. Solomon would have to make many decisions throughout his kingship, throughout his rule. And he would also have to deal with these particular situations, some of them that was not his responsibility so much as he caused them directly, but yet were his responsibility because of the mantle he would be picking up. You have in particular a case where blood is shed outside of war for blood that was shed during war. If you go back and look at the particulars of this account, we might think, well, he's justified. He was justified in avenging his brothers. He was justified in avenging his brothers in arms as well. Here he's taking out an enemy that had turned over to the other side. Yet what David points out was that in a time of peace, he tried to avenge blood that had been shed at a time of war. Very different circumstances. You see the other occasion of somebody that had cursed David. David had promised that he would not himself put him to death, even for this individual's mistake. You see, those that had honored David, those that had been there for David, would also be taken care of, executing justice, a mantle that was put on Solomon's shoulders. This, perhaps, is what lingers with us the most, the practical application of the things that David has told Solomon. Proverbs chapter 22, verses 8 and 9 say, "Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of his fury will fail. Whoever has a bountiful life will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor." Kind of that old adage that we've heard before, you reap what you sow. Now, specifically, when that phrase is used in the New Testament, it's dealing with when you give, that giving will be given back to you. And that if you reap, or if you sow spiritual things, then you can expect to reap spiritual things. But if you only sow physical things, you can only expect to reap physical things. However, that idea is found not only here in Proverbs 22, 8 and 9, but in various other scriptures in the Old Testament. What happens to the individual that is violent, that is unjust? We just studied through the book of Habakkuk on Sunday nights. And in one of our last studies, Habakkuk pronounced some woes and wrote them down. There seems to be an answer from God, these woes to people who have conquered other nations and devoured other people's lands, that someone would devour them. Woe to the individual that did not execute justice. The wisdom writer here in Proverbs 22 conveys the same point. David had some last wishes for Solomon. In short, he desired that Solomon would be the type of individual that he could be proud of, the type of individual that would lead Israel in a positive way, the type of individual that he could count on to do the kinds of things that needed to be done to lead Israel in the right direction. We know from the life of Solomon that he made many mistakes, that there are many things that he didn't do right. But we also know from the life of Solomon that many things that he did where it seems he was heeding his father's advice. Oh, if in everything he could have listened to his father. Oh, if in everything he could have heeded these words that are similar to others that God has given his ruler of his people over and over again. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Walk in my statutes. Be before me blameless. The heeds that he gave, he asked Israel to heed. To not go from the right or the left hand, to stay in the path of his law. I want to leave you with a question this evening. Will you take David's advice? I believe David's advice, at least in principle, can apply to each and every individual here. I believe each and every individual here needs to be cognizant of death, understanding that it is a future event that is coming for all of us, something we need to prepare for. I think each and every individual here needs to bear in mind of how we need to act while we're here, who we need to be looking forward to and up to, and what our purpose in this life really is. I think everyone in here, like Solomon, needs to understand the importance of executing justice, needs to understand the importance of not leaving things undone and making sure they get taken care of. Maybe you're here this evening, and some of these words from David could shed a little bit of light in your life. Maybe you're here this evening, and David's advice could bless you and help you. I hope that it can, and I hope that you'll take his advice. I hope that while we're here this evening, you'll allow us to encourage you. Allow us to pray for you. That some of the struggles and burdens you've had to bear might be lightened, or at least that you have the strength to bear them with endurance. as we see the day drawing near. Or maybe you're here this evening. This is a path you've not embarked down yet. Maybe you're here this evening and you have not begun your walk with God. I want to encourage you towards that endeavor as well. Come follow Jesus. Come and accept the sacrifice that He has made through obeying the gospel. His death, His burial, and resurrection. Obeyed not only in the heart but also in action. And dying to this world, being buried in water, in symbol of that death and burial, so that you can be raised, not just today out of that water, but one day again when Jesus comes, raised to a life eternal. If you're here this evening and you're subject to that invitation, won't you come right now together and stand and sing?